So, I watched Elephant, which is a 2003 film from director Gus Van Sant, and what I understood going into the film, aside from the fact that it's largely based on Columbine, and that it had a more homoerotic interpretation of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold's dynamic, which I do find highly probable or possible in that in reality, the two engaged in some sort of homosexual exploratory activity and could have been some sort of killer queer duo in the end. However, that's not really the point at all, actually. So the film opens on a shot of lights at what is presumably a football field in front of a gray-green overcast sky, sort of like if a tornado is about to form by the color scheme. Then it switches to a drunk parent driving, then pulled over by his choppy-haired, bleached blonde son, John, who the parent then tries to make up with his child by talking about going hunting together over the weekend. Then cut to a photographer named Eli in a park photographing a punk couple. A tag team football match in a field where, before what appears to be a more legitimate practice goes on in the background. John arrives at school and calls his brother to come pick up their hungover father, as the principal walks in behind him and sends him to the administrative office for tardiness. A brunette wearing a beach-style necklace then walks into frame, putting on a red lifeguard hoodie as the camera pans and proceeds to follow him across the campus, where he stops to meet a girl who he's presumably dating, then walking into class with her after the viewer learns their name, Nathan and Carrie. John receives detention. And then it goes to a shot of John crying, a girl kisses him on the cheek, and then she goes to a gay-straight Alliance Club meeting, cut to the meeting where a never-changing youthful discussion about human sexuality occurs. And so for the majority of this section, I was under the impression, as I mistakenly slipped up earlier in my reading of this, that John was an imitation of Eric Harris based on the hair. However, after stopping in the hall for Eli to take a picture of him, walks out the door where he's greeted by two armed students walking into the building where their names are revealed. Eric and Alex. A bit on the nose for the Eric one. And so, two scenes in a row then, with the Dylan Klebold representative Alex, one of which depicts him going through the kitchen and cafeteria taking notes. And when inquired about this by a classmate, he answers in what can only be known as foreboding by the audience, saying that she'll just have to wait and see. And with that, I realized what the film is. It focuses on the mundane aspects of a school shooting, the elephant in an otherwise banal room. And in that, with its focusing on the different perspectives, also likens to the old parable about three men feeling an elephant, all with their own incorrect opinion and personal truth of feeling the large animal. It's personal, not statistical in its portrayal. It's very, very fascinating in that. And so, from there, it begins focusing on three girls, briefly shown as Nathan passed by them in his long walk scene. I think this is so, and from there, I began to think, this is showing who is going to die side by side with who will be the reason why, and who will be negatively seen in the wake of their deadly actions. It's an interesting style of simultaneous one-shots. I want to live to get mine, one of the girls' remarks regarding a driver's license as they walk from the cafeteria into a restroom wherein they perform bulimic activities side-by-side stalls. The Eric Harris caricature, succinctly named Eric, enters the scene as Alex, or Dylan, plays Beethoven on his piano. The elephant in the room here clear as day, and that it's a deconstruction of the idea music to blame was for Columbine. He comes in through some basement window and proceeds to hop on a bed, open a laptop computer, and begin playing a Doom imitation. About half an hour left in the film from there. The Beethoven ceases and Alex joins Eric on the couch, taking the computer into his own jurisdiction, and goes to a website selling guns. Then it cuts to a scene at night, storming, while the camera slowly gives an overview of the room and two future perpetrators asleep. Waking up for a breakfast of pancakes, then ditching school to wait for the arrival of guns ordered 2 scenes prior. Waiting in the living room, watching a documentary on Nazi Germany until they do. Getting them, the narrator on TV flatly asks, "Peace, did Hitler say?" as they tore into the packaging of their newly purchased automatic weaponry. They then proceed to Alex's garage, where they practice shooting at a pile of accumulated firewood there. The focus changes once again to a face shown prior, but now given the name Michelle, wearing a pinkish red sweater, half walking, half sort of jogging down the hall, passing by Eli as he snaps his picture of John. She makes her way to the library, where she signs in and begins working reshelving volumes. And then to Dylan once more, this time showering. Eric then joins, and one comments, "I never kissed anybody," and the two proceed to do just that under the running water. It then cuts to both dressed, tying their shoes, and going over a map spliced with them setting up explosives in the cafeteria in moments yet to occur in the near future. Most importantly, have fun, Alex tells Eric. A silent drive then in a car with a cracked front window as they go to their educational institution, where they then encounter John on their way into the campus buildings. Following John then as he runs to warn others, is what the camera does. And so I stopped taking any sort of notes for the culmination of the event as the two conducted their sociopathic massacre. And it shows, obviously them shooting other kids, and then Eric ranting to the principal about actually listening to struggling, troubled kids, then shooting him numerous times in the back after letting him run for personal amusement. Alex entering the bathroom with the three girls doing their bulimic activities and proceeding to kill them. And then they eventually meet up, Alex and Eric do, for a brief interaction as partners in crime, and Alex then proceeds to shoot Eric while they were discussing their kill count. And then Alex moves on into the kitchen, where he finds and corners Nathan and Carrie in the freezer, and proceeds to listlessly, albeit with a hint of personal bemusement, recite "Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo" while waving the automatic rifle between the two. Movie cutting back to the overcast gray-green sky where it began, just without any light in it, any light pole in it now. Just as he gets to the end with no clear indication of who he shot next. Just one or both. Himself too? The elephant in the room. And so that was the movie, and I researched it a bit more and learned that Gus Van Sant's presentation of events was heavily inspired, as well as taking its title from a 1989 BBC short film by Alan Clark. Fittingly about murder as well. It depicts numerous senseless acts of murder where rhyme and reason are stripped away. In a way, it's very Lynchian, as its imitation by Sant and their emphasis on long, uncut scenes following a character, allowing for the viewer to simply take it in and sit within it, and it becomes, well, the elephant in the room. And so, from there, I watched another movie called 0 Day, which is another adaptation of the Columbine Massacre, which came out in 2002, a year prior to Sant's Elephant. And so the movie has more of a found footage feel to it, seemingly imitating the real home videos created by Eric and Dylan, opening with an almost one-to-one physical embodiments of the class of 99 killers, introducing them as Calvin and Andre, respectively. Calvin being Eric, Andre being Dylan. And in this, it shows a birthday party for a 5-year-old Calvin, sitting rather unamused and looking quite uncomfortable. It seems he's portrayed in a way that would be today phrased as an autistic way. And so the main introduction to the two, however, comes in a few minutes after these opening credits, where the two and a friend set up a camera in front of their school, where Calvin gives a standard mockery of the whole, best years of our lives trope, so often repeated by adults in regards to the teenage experience. And at this point, it would seem Calvin has a plan. Whether Andre knows and is in on it beyond his scheming is unknown to the viewer. With direct allusion to real statements made by and written in the diaries of Eric and Dylan, it's a lot more on the nose about the coming violent event than Elephant, even with something like Alex taking notes in the cafeteria and making a reference only he and the audience would understand. And so the footage then cuts between dates a lot here. And it goes to old school teenage debauchery, lighting illegal fireworks at a lake on the 4th of July, and using long since expired eggs to throw at a house in the middle of the night on Andre's birthday, using a newly gifted camera to capture the moment. And so from there, it's more redoing of the Columbine home movies, now confirming Andre knows the plan as he explains the plan for posthumous uncovering of their tell-all footage. They open a space in a nearby bank so as to prevent any sort of pre-mortem discovery. And then, more mundane, banal bits spliced into what would generally be viewed as insane as Calvin gets his bottom bracket of braces removed. And, from there it cuts to them going through Andre's father's gun collection, which, according to Andre, was used for hunting. He explains that in spite of being out of the room by his dad's own design when he would go to grab the mobile artillery, he has known where both the safe and key were located since the 5th grade and was merely humoring his parent thereafter. Andre then constructs one of the rifles after sorting through the other guns. July then turns to August, showing Calvin exploring a cemetery with a girl named Rachel, who comments that she views Andre as violent and weird, and from what can be gathered, the feeling of dislike between the two is quite mutual, her viewing him as having, quote, a lot of anger, unquote, unresolved. And that makes her uncomfortable. Calvin asks her about how she perceives their dynamic, to which she says she views Andre as the more dominant and in charge of the two. She then takes the camera and asks Calvin as to why he films everything, with no real answer directly given, just sort of half-amusing jokes and, self-deprecating humor. And then it goes to a bit where Andre and Calvin are constructing untested pipe bombs, espousing detailed instructions on how to and the efficiency in certain techniques. And much of that was pulled directly from the online presence of Eric Harris, which it then cuts to Calvin musing on the difference between mere suicide, which he notes, well, thousands do, and that he's no different. What makes his case exceptional is his choice, is his, as he deems it, way of the samurai addition to the act. On another date, the two then discuss Andre's cousin Chris and using him as an unbeknownst patsy to steal guns from for their 0-day plan. Going out with an unsuspecting Chris to practice shooting, footage of which, again, harkening back to that taken by the real-life perpetrators in Littleton, Colorado. And then back at his cousin's place, they inquire to him in what to most would seem a typical youthful, morbid curiosity, which gun would be the most optimal to use to kill a person, to which Chris responds that any would really do the trick. And so then it shows more mundane things like camping with Calvin's family, a brief moment of him joking around with his younger brother, which is it's a lighthearted moment. It's, and it definitely contrasts with the later actions. And so from there, August becomes September, and Andre recites their plan, explaining why they have no set date except to wait until the temperature outside reaches exactly 0 degrees Fahrenheit, as it would be announced on the morning radio as the two woke up to it in the morning. And so there they go over their invasion plan with a slideshow on an old box computer, which they're explaining it is meant to laid out for their own killing spree and outline for others to imitate. Eric expresses anticipation then in a video on his own. And so later on in the course of the month, the two go to a poetry reading at night where Calvin gets on the stage in a military-style outfit and recites his own piece, comparing himself to a bullet in the Third Reich, ending the limerick with the line, "And it's a wasted life." He then gets off stage and the two heckle the next act and leave as Andre expresses annoyance and dramatically emphasizes that Calvin could have really caused a major social and personal repercussions from his reading being so topical. But, how would anyone know? September then, give me a second. I need a coffee. September then cuts suddenly to New Year's Eve, and clearly nothing came of the reading, which it then fast forwards to January 10th, where Calvin explains while the temperature had in fact reached 0, their plan was forcefully postponed on account of Andre catching the stomach virus. And Calvin then explains that while Andre has an ideal of some inter-school, interstate spree after their own school is shot up, he at least knows he will be coming back out of the school in a body bag, even if his partner does not yet. And so it goes from there back to the bank where they're, loading in more tapes that they had filmed and that we've seen, that the viewer sees. And they talk about leaving a trail to their box of videotapes, talking about the superficial blame which will undoubtedly be attributed to various influences from music to movies, which Calvin asserts as wrong because the idea is their own. January then fast forwards even more to April, where the two have a bonfire. They're burning their books, video games, and movies so as to emphasize that the idea was truly of their own scheming. Calvin reading a kind-hearted note that Andre had saved from a girl who he sat next to in a class in the 8th grade, much to Andre's dismay. And in burning all their shit, they realized now they really have to act quickly. Then they talk about prom, Andre detailing his disdain of Rachel, banal teenage drama. And then they sort of turn to the topic of who was the leader in the coming escapade, likely mocking the notion for future sleuths onto the case. From there, it goes to a limo all of a sudden with a person named Josh filming, picking both Calvin and Rachel up. Andre not present, as he explained a scene prior, that he wouldn't stoop so low to go to prom. I agree with that. I'm 20, why am I saying that? Young adults enthusiastic with menial adolescent babble, really. It then cuts to Andre being filmed by his dad on presumably the camera he bought for his son for his birthday at the beginning of the movie, surprising him at work, then riding in the car with him while expressing pride in him as they make a final pizza delivery, and then head home after. And from there it goes back to the limo less than around an hour later, post-prom clearly, and the party more ratty than ever, likely a bit intoxicated. And Calvin has the driver then take him to Andre's to be dropped off. We acted alone, Calvin emphasized once again an hour after arriving to Andre's, as the two talk of how it was all an act of their own volition, and even if they had been discovered earlier, it would have done nothing, and they would have enacted their plan eventually nonetheless. Could you blame them for not noticing, Andre asks, whilst Calvin then pins the responsibility onto the world around them for molding them into doing the soon-to-commence shooting. Relating it to a duel like in the old days, a way to squash beef. And then they relate themselves as deities in human form for their ability to choose life and death of their classmates. And their whole point in the act was, as they deem it, respect and love for fellow man, and acknowledging the seeming contradiction in their perpetration and doing away with it being in order to teach people to value life. Little John Kramer's, I know. They then finally go back to Chris's house to steal the weaponry, only slightly complicated by a party across the street. But they manage to get the guns and leave Chris, the clueless cousin, a note that they had merely borrowed the guns to use in one of their home movies. From there, it turns to the next day, May 1st, the morning after, and they park in the school lot preparing their firearms, expressing nervousness and debating who gets and wants what gun, and they talk about how instrumental each other are to the act. They then exit the vehicle, leaving the camera rolling on the dashboard as they make their way into the school. From there, it shows black and white security camera footage as 911 calls are overlaid over the chaos unfolding. Throughout the bloody ordeal, the operator on the phone left on attempts to make herself audible to Andre, whose name she learned from someone yelling it, and repeatedly attempting to reason to unhearing ears. She describes what she hears in the room, a library from the landline audio, until the two simultaneously blow their brains out. The film then cuts to 9 days after their attack, with some other adolescents sneaking onto the campus grounds where crosses have been erected to the dead youth, including Calvin and Andre. the two crosses for them are already vandalized beyond belief. Fuck you, similar to what Ed Gein's tombstone looked like before it got taken. And so the troop then proceeds to light them on fire and drive away as the movie ends. And so with that, I have some thoughts. I was discussing with a friend once regarding the epidemic of school shootings, stating I personally doubt such events would cease anytime soon. More likely it is that they will evolve into some other form. The school shooter, as Calvin noted, and Shane Bugbee has explained to me, evolved out of strings of suicides, which would start with one kid, then run through a school, and then infect another nearby. That base never really has gone away, ever. However, given the perpetrators in such an event like a school shooting, many, if not most of them, meet their own end in such a way as well, after their blaze of glory. And so, with that, both films explore the mundane aspect of the murders, even with the central reference point of Columbine, which in of itself is banal. As a result of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, it's an eyesore, whereas had the events of April 20th, 1999 not occurred, it would be passed like any other educational institution is on the road. I wouldn't go out of my way, while I'm driving through Colorado to drive through Littleton to stay the night there, which I did. And so, in a bit of irony, give me a second. I needed to grab some more coffee. And so, in a bit of irony to it all, like Calvin and Andre relating themselves to deities in Eric Harris's shirt on the day of the massacre reading Natural Selection, none of it would actually seem so. And with that, I harken back to the 1989 inspiration for the 2003 Elephant adaptation. As what's presented is senseless and without meaning, beyond likenability to the three blind men feeling around. And so, as none of it's done ever over food or shelter or any resources beyond a vague motif of revenge. Certainly other species like dolphins engage in the activity of killing for sport. And however, the fittest blowing their brains out with their victims, only achieving their goal posthumously and getting on the cover of, say, Time magazine. It's another case to be gawked at, grappled with, and grabbed onto with mortal fascination or imitation. Often a bit of all those I just mentioned. However, a contrasting view to the violence depicted in these films and mundane surrounding them all, I think of Gregg Araki's Teenage Apocalypse trilogy, namely the second installment, The Doom Generation. This movie portrays a wild ride of one single night that three adolescents share, and they go through a ringer of violence and bisexual exploration, which culminates in Jamie Duvall's character having his penis chopped off by a gang of neo-Nazis, dying from shock and blood loss as the leader of the group proceeds to rape Rose McGowan's character. They then, in turn, get killed, and Rose escapes outside with the other still alive young adult, driving off as if really nothing ever happens. She lights a cigarette, a minor but constant dissociative self-medication throughout the entire movie, beginning and ending with said actions so simple and everyday. And so the difference in the nihilistic violence portrayed by Araki in his films is that while senseless, it's often enacted upon the youth by older forces, while in Zero Day, Elephant, and Columbine, the gore is caused by the youth brutalizing the youth. And so with that, the full answer is that there is no answer, like I told my friend. It's sort of, as Gus Van Sant and his predecessor implored, an elephant in the mundane malaise.